Hi, Simply Vegas agent. Right now we're going to go through how to have your seller complete a seller's real property disclosure statement. It is incredibly important that your seller complete this form. This is not something that you can send over to DocuSign, and it can never have your handwriting on the form or you checking in the boxes. Most of the time, if your seller is not in person with you, send it over as a PDF and have them complete it and sign it and send it back to you. There's a few questions at the top of the form. Firstly, obviously the dates going in. If you've had a listing for a long time and there's been an incident in a property before you get a buyer in, it's important to redo this form so that your seller can add those portions to it. That would include if you have a deal fall out of escrow due to a property inspection item, your seller needs to put that in there because now they know of it. The most important part that we'll get down to as we go through the form is, are you aware? Meaning, is your seller aware of an issue? If they are not aware of an issue, they're going to mark no. If they are aware of an issue, they're going to mark yes. As we get to the top of the form, first question, it's saying, have you ever lived in the property? If they've lived in the property, it's a really simple yes, no answer. They mark yes if they've lived there. If they've never lived there, they mark no. Going through to the type of seller, whether it be a bank, asset management company, owner-occupier, the most typical thing going in the other section is if it's been a rental property. In that case, they would be an investor. Now we go through to the individual items, again, reiterating, are you aware of any issue with this part of the form? They're marking no if they're not aware, they're marking yes if they are aware. Some of these are going to be non-applicable. It's incredibly important that your seller read the form carefully. A lot of properties in Vegas don't have a septic tank or leach field. So in that instance, that would be non-applicable. The same applies for a well and pump, non-applicable. So they need to go through line by line on every single item. Something else that is incredibly important with this form is every box has to be checked. You cannot leave a box blank. It will cause a red flag. It will get sent back to you when a buyer's agent reviews it for their client. If there's no other, then you're simply going to mark non-applicable in the other section. And obviously the seller, it needs to initial the bottom of the form. Going through to the next page, there's some very important, very misunderstood questions on the next page. The first one is very simple. If there's ever been any kind of water damage in the property, your seller must mark yes. The next page after this one is going to have explanations. So any box that gets marked yes on this page, your seller has to write an explanation on the following page. If there's ever been a structural defect on the property, again, that's a very, very simple yes, no answer that needs to be explained. Have any parts of the property been modified or altered without building permits? A very good example of that, I have a property at the moment that has a cabana in the backyard. It's a simple structure that was never permitted. Very important that it be disclosed that there was no permit pulled for that. Then the buyer has the option to pull out of the contract when it's revealed that there is no permit for that. That's something, again, that it would be a good idea to put on the agent-to-agent remarks so that a buyer knows going into the property that something wasn't permitted. Has the property ever been subject to a government structural defect claim? For those of us that have been around for a while in the business, we remember the Kitech plumbing, etc. That's a very good example of a government structural defect claim where there's been a class action lawsuit addressing a structural defect with the property. If that is marked yes, you are then going to need to get all of the accompanying documents to include with this form and also indicate on the next page exactly what that structural defect or government claim was. Next line is talking about land and foundation. Any of the improvements located on unstable or expansive soil. We don't have a lot of earth stability problems in town, but your seller needs to indicate if ever there's been a large settlement issue at the house, whether it's been repaired or not. Any foundation sliding, settlement movement, upheaval, or earth stability problems is a very similar question. Again, if there's problems, typically in somewhere like California where you have landslides, etc., not seen often here, but if the property's had that kind of issue, obviously needs to be disclosed. Any drainage, flooding, water seepage, or high water table, that's really indicating if when it rains, if there's any kind of a problem or if there's been a previous issue. And the secondary portion of that is it in a flood zone? Again, there are flood zone maps available. If your seller doesn't know that it's in a flood zone or not, it's easy to investigate that for him or her. Is the property located next to any known future development? This is really simple. If there's a piece of vacant land next door, that's a future development. If you are close to it, there is no harm in your seller addressing this. A lot of properties in town are adjacent or near future developments. Any encroachments, easements, zoning violations, or non-conforming uses. That's where a property is being misused without permission from whichever governing body deals with that kind of use. So it's something that we're not typically going to see in residential, but if they're using it for something funky and you're selling it for something funky and it doesn't have permission, you definitely need to disclose that. Is the property adjacent to open range land? Open range land is a gun range. It's not just an open piece of property. So if there's a gun range next door, that's where you're disclosing it. Any problems with the roof is self-explanatory. Any problems with a pool or spa, you'll see that there's a non-applicable box next to that as well. So if the property doesn't have a pool or spa, your seller needs to indicate non-applicable on there. Any history of infestation, termites, etc. Self-explanatory question. Same with any environmental substances stored on the property. The next line, has the property been the site of a crime? That's only if it's been used as a meth lab. The cleanup with meth labs are very, very important. And so if there's ever been an issue with a rental property, it has to be completed. It's imperative. And any previous or current fungus or mold, that's dealing with if there's been water damage, if there's been mold remediation through an insurance company, etc. That has to be completed as yes. And again, the insurance company will always keep the history of the remediation, the mold testing, etc., which you need to send on to the buyer accompanying this form. Number 8, any feature of the property shared in common with adjoining landowners. This is typically marked incorrectly by most sellers. The walls that go around the majority of the properties in town are shared with the house next door. If that wall falls down, or what's far more common, if a tree root uproots the wall, it's up to both sides to pay for the new wall, so that would be shared in common. That's what you need to have disclosed to a buyer. Now we get to the common interest communities section. A lot of these are going to be marked yes. First of all, if it's in a homeowners association with a gate, with a park, etc., then there are co-owned areas called common areas. That's going to be a yes. And again, when we go to the next page of this form, you're going to explain, your seller's going to explain exactly what that is. If there's an association fee, very simple answer to the question. And then on the next page, they write on there how much the association fee is. Any unpaid assessments or fines, and any warnings or notices that give rise to an assessment, fine, or lien. If your seller is in violation of the homeowners association and they're getting fined, they need to disclose it. It's going to come up when escrow does the search and asks for the HOA docs. Any litigation or arbitration or mediation with the common areas. These we see far mostly commonly with homeowners associations on condominiums, etc., but they are occasionally on larger HOAs. You'll find those, they need to be disclosed. Any assessments associated with a property. This is the portion where if there's an an SID, then that you're going to indicate that is an assessment and that is going to be assumed by the incoming buyer. If you don't know, there's a very simple search online where you can search and find out if there is an SID or LID associated with the property, and then you can indicate the amount on the next page. Any construction, modification, or alterations made without required approval from the homeowners association. If something's done in the backyard, we're back to that cabana, and it was put in without the HOA's permission, you need to indicate that there was never permission got from the HOA. That's the box to fill it in. Any problems with the water supply? Again, your seller's going to know if there's a water supply issue. That's a simple yes or no answer. Any other conditions of the property that are going to materially affect its value. Again, it could be something random. I've got no specific instance for this, but that's going to be yes or no if there's something. The key with this is to over-disclose rather than under-disclose. Lead-based paint, really simple. If the house was built before 12/31/77, you've got to disclose that there might be lead-based paint in there. Water source, whether it's municipal, whether it's community well, domestic well, etc., very simple to complete. The next line down is conservation easements. A while ago in town, you used to be able to get money back from the water district if you converted your yard from grass to water conserving plants. If that had been the place, obviously a new buyer is going to get fined or penalized if he then puts the grass back in, because that seller would have received money to convert it, so that needs to be disclosed. Solar panels, big issue. If there are solar panels on the property, it has to be disclosed whether or not they're owned or leased. If they are leased, accompanying this form needs to be the lease paperwork so the buyer can review it and decide if they want to go through with the transaction. Wastewater disposal, whether it's on septic, sewer, etc. And then private transfer fee obligation. Some communities in town have a private transfer fee associated with them. If you're not sure, research it. Let your seller know yes or no there is a private transfer fee obligation associated with the property. The next page is where your seller's explanations go. That's where they're going to list anything that they marked yes to on the previous page. It needs to be itemized here with accompanying documentation if necessary. The next page talks about all of the NRS statutes that govern this form. Every one of these pages needs to be initialed by your seller and then obviously initialed by the buyer when they come in. And then lastly, the signature page for your sellers, whether or not they're an LLC, a trust, they need to indicate on there exactly how they're holding title and what their role is. And then the date goes on there as well. So a very important form, again, needs to be reviewed with your seller. Can't emphasize enough, it's the seller that completes the form, you do not. Thanks very much for your time.